Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is at Close Talking. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is at Close Talking Poetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/closetalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show. Hello, and welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking. I am your co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I am your co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And we are here today to talk about, shockingly enough, in a radical lack of departure from our regular format, a poem. We're going to talk about a poem. We are going to read the poem, we're going to talk about the poem, and then we're going to read the poem again. But before we get into that, our quick and mildly desperate plea. If you enjoy the show, it would mean the world to us if you would hop on over to iTunes and give us a rating, preferably 5 stars, but, you know, as the spirit moves you, and a review, because ratings and reviews are the best way to help the podcast find new listeners. It helps us out in the magic Apple iTunes algorithms. You know, we're poetry people. We don't know how that works. Well, Connor took calculus because he's super smart. But anyway, Connor can tell you all about algorithms. I don't know how they work, but I know that ratings and reviews are the best way to help us climb up that algorithmic ladder.
I know very little.
Agree to disagree. But anyway,
do rate us. It really helps. We thank you.
But enough about Apple and iTunes. We are here to talk about poetry, and specifically the poem Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver recently passed away, and we thought it was only fitting that we talk about one of her poems. And this is a poem that I selected, and I thought about which of her poems, because she has a lot of them, and they are very good, which one to select. And initially, I was leaning away from the two that might be categorized as her sort of greatest hits, which are this one, Wild Geese, and the other one, The Summer Day. And then I realized, you know what? I think it's a greatest hit for a reason, so we should talk about Wild Geese. Very quickly before I read the poem, Mary Oliver is probably one of the most popular American poets, if not the most popular and best known. Part of the reason for that is because she writes in a very, she gets tagged all the time in a somewhat disparaging way with the dreaded A word, accessible. But she does write in a very accessible way about a lot of her poems deal with nature and the natural world. She had an incredibly successful, both in terms of popularity, but also in terms of recognition from prizes. She won a ton of them. She got a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1980. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her book American Primitive in 1984. And in 1992, she won the National Book Award for her new and selected poems. A lot of her work grows out of her connection to place, both growing up in Ohio and the area around where she grew up, because she often escaped her somewhat difficult family life by going off on these long walks in nature, but also the town that she then built her life and home in, which is Provincetown, Massachusetts. And she lived other places at different parts in her life, but Provincetown is a big part of who she was as a person and as a writer. So I think that's everything I've got as context on Mary Oliver. I don't know if you have anything you want to make sure we get in there.
That's a good summation.
Excellent. So with no further ado, Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
It's a good one.
I am so into this poem. I've always really enjoyed Mary Oliver's poetry. Indeed, on the very first episode of this podcast, gave her a little shout out because it's kind of a cliche, but the end of her other major poem, The Summer Day, is the famous, "Tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life." I found that very inspiring in the wake of a fairly life-draining presidential election result. It was sort of a nice reminder about like personal agency and, keeping yourself motivated to like fight the good fight in the face of darkness. But yeah, I'm very into this poem. I'm curious what your thoughts are for a poem like this, which is like, I don't know what you would call it, like a modern classic.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Sort of like Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight in many ways.
Yeah. No, it's there was like a New Yorker piece. I think that was published recently after she passed away, and it was talking about this poem and said, in a 2001 talk to the Lannan Foundation, she introduced Wild Geese, which, with The Summer Day, as you were mentioning, is her poetic equivalent of an arena rock ballad. Which, yeah, seems right.
Dream on! Dream on!
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's, yeah, I really love it. It's interesting because sometimes I remember the poem and I sort of remember like the kind of, like the beginning, you do not have to be good. This end, like the world offers itself to your imagination. These kind of like the big statements of the poem in some kind of way. Which I think are very powerful, but sometimes I forget just the way that the poem moves and all the sort of little things that are going on in the poem, which I think, especially as it became more popular, I think, one of the great powers, and also I think in addition to the sort of accessibility aspect, which people curmudgeonly academics disparage, I think there's also this, it's, the speaker of this poem and a lot of Mary Oliver's poems are kind of like a sage poet, or like someone who has this kind of wisdom or knowledge and is kind of telling you about it. There's a didactic quality to it where it's like, you do not have to be good. It's not like, there is personal expression, but it's not like an expressive poem of like, this is what it was like for me. It's like, I'm addressing you and I'm telling you a way that you can live a life, basically. And so I think that oftentimes I forget. I remember the sort of the teaching moments that the poem offers, the wisdom that it brings, but I forget the poem part of it, which is how it moves. And so it was really, I was just glad that we could spend the time to think about that in the poem sort of as an entirety.
Definitely. I think it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of sage aspect, because I think in a way, because this is addressed to you, there's this sense, kind of because of how it ends, where the speaker is telling you, like, hey, you fit into the world. It's almost like the speaker is placing the you at the end, where there's sort of this direction being given almost, which can feel, because of how the poem is constructed, it feels like a very gentle placement and like a comforting placement. And I think there's even almost like a therapeutic side to it. Kind of like where the speaker calls out, tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. There's like this specific kind of interpersonal communion going on, but it does feel like the speaker is on a slightly different level than the you in terms of like understanding some stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I mean, it's kind of, it's again the power, but also the risk, which is like, any choice sort of has those two aspects to it. But of this sort of heavy second person is that it makes sort of strong assumptions about this you, who the you is, or what the you is going through, which is like a very a bold move for a poem that maybe it was, in the time of its writing addressed to a specific person, but now, is read by, anyone and everyone, who are coming from, so many different places. Like starting with, you do not have to be good. That already assumes the reader is kind of struggling with some kind of guilt or shame about like, I'm trying to live my life this way, or like I find myself maybe like indulging in something that I feel ashamed about, or I'm, living too selfishly, or any sort of kind of conflict like that. And I think that it's successful because it is a very common, probably near, everyone thinks about it sometimes. I also think it's a particularly American, there's a lot of shame and guilt, which there probably is everywhere. But so to begin with, you do not have to be good. If someone, wasn't sort of either had never felt that or wasn't in a particular place to feel that, it immediately would be distancing for them potentially, because it's the you would suddenly miss them. So yeah, I think you're right to talk about also the fact that the speaker is on a kind of different level. It's almost like someone is like has been crawling in a cave and is desperate, and Mary Oliver sort of descends with, is like, here is the way out of the cave, and I will show you the light, kind of thing.
Descends on the wings of a wild goose, perhaps. I
Yes.
totally agree. I do personally just find that as an opening line to be genius. How good is that line?
It's
Because
so
I
good.
think almost everybody has something about themselves about which they do not feel good.
Yeah.
Like 99.9% of the human population. I agree also that it has a particular kind of like American tinge of guilt to it, which is like a whole thing that is like hard to parse out what exactly that might be, but it's something that kind of permeates a lot of her work, is this very specific kind of like undercurrent of like guilt or shame or uncertainty about personal goodness, probably also stemming a little bit from her relationship to religion, which was very important to her. Her relationship to faith and religion and God was something she thought and about a lot. But just like how cool is you do not have to be good, just right out of the gate. Dang. Yeah. And I have two things that I was thinking about. One thing I learned from listening to Mary Oliver's interview for the On Being podcast, and I admit I only listened to the unedited version. Don't know if this made it into the full one. I have to imagine it made it into the edited version because, whoa. But Mary Oliver revealed that this whole poem started because she was making a point to a friend about end-stopped lines. And so it was originally going to be a poem where all the lines were end-stopped, and she was going to be like, look, you can do that too. Like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. And so it was kind of like to her friend who was, like, or a student who was like working on poetry. And she was just like, yeah, no, I'll just bang out a quick poem on some end-stopped lines and like, you know, it'll be fine. Wow. And it turned into this, one of the best known and most widely shared poems probably today, currently. So yeah, that's kind of crazy, which also speaks to like, she was somebody who was very intense about writing a lot all the time. She had a very like consistent writing practice, and it shows, that kind of dedication shows when you can sit down to do a kind of nothing, like, oh yeah, I'm just going to do this, you know, like some end stop lines, and you end up with a poem that is this meaningful to so many people. Like, that doesn't just happen. That's because you have written thousands of other poems, good, bad, published, immediately discarded. Like, you just are so in the practice of crafting your thoughts into poems that you can sit down and do that. I think that's a really cool, just kind of like, whoa, way to go.
I love that. Oh my God. I had no idea.
Isn't that crazy?
That is so cool. Yeah, no, you're totally right. It's like I feel like when I was sort of first starting to write, I was thinking about, which I still do sometimes, but it's like, I want to write about this feeling, or like, this happened to me and this is the content that I want to write. And I feel like as I've written more, not nearly as much as Mary Oliver did.
Really?
No, in fact, quite a bit less, and my work ethic is quite a bit worse. But I've developed a sort of, you become comfortable with a certain range of content, or you become assured that certain things are available to you, and so you can kind of, in your sort of, that those things become more of a muscle memory type thing. And so in your deliberate thoughts, you can be like, I'm going to write end stop lines, and everything else will come from there. You can get very specific. So that's fascinating. It is true that this poem sort of makes very good use of end stop lines. You know, the beginning, you do not have to be good. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. There are lines that have, there's longer sentences, but there's very few enjammed lines. So there's, you do not have to walk on your knees, line break for 100 miles. That's one of them. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain, line break, are moving across the landscapes. And then at the end, over and over, announcing your place, line break, in the family of things. Those are the only instances where there's not like a period or a comma or something like that. Yeah, and I think, I mean, the basic thing you could say about that is it lends itself to a very assured, sort of steady, confident, authoritative tone.
I totally agree. I think there's one other one because you only have to let the soft animal of your body, line break, love what it loves. So I
Yes.
think there's
Right.
4 lines in an 18-line poem that do not have any kind of punctuation at the end. But yeah, it's this very assured voice, partially because of the strong declaration at the beginning, but also because of that assurance throughout, and the fact that I had also read that New Yorker article where it likens it to an arena rock ballad. I was thinking of Tom Petty, who's somebody else who I know I've talked about him before on the podcast. Sorry, everybody, it's a thing. But he passed away not long ago, October of 2017, and was someone else whose work was known for being like more plain spoken than other people who do what he did. So the other people who are known as like really great rock songwriters are like Bruce Springsteen, and he comes out with these lines, that are really either ornate in his early records, or they have these really complicated, I was going to be your Romeo, you were going to be my Juliet. These days you don't wait on Romeos, you wait on that welfare check. There's lost angels on your fire escape. They lie to your mama for you, trying to keep you safe. Like, it's very different kinds of language than Tom Petty, who comes out with this song, I won't back down. I won't back down. You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down. And it's one of his most successful songs by far, like immediately completely resonated with people more so than any other song he ever released. He said people would sing it back and tell him how much it meant to them, that specific song. And in the process of writing it, he was very worried that it was like too straightforward. He had come too close to just saying something. But it turned out to be a really important message, and it fit very much with who he was as a person. He got into all these disputes with his record label and like refused to back down in the face of them telling him like, we're going to sue you forever, you can't afford your lawyers, blah 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 blah. Like, he was somebody who himself was like not going to back down. So there's an authenticity in the message, the same way I think there's a deep authenticity in what Mary Oliver is saying here in this poem about, in the face of despair, turning to the natural world, which we can get into the intricacies of. But I was also thinking of him because, as I was saying, like, this poem was initially started as like kind of an exercise for a friend, and it turned into something else, which is what happened with another song from the Full Moon Fever album that was incredibly popular, Free Falling, where they were mixing another song and Tom Petty's at the keyboard and he's trying to make his producer laugh. So he's like playing some chords and he's like, she's a good girl, loves her mama, loves Jesus, and America too. And that's why that song is like, again, resonated with a lot of people. But when you look at the lyrics, you're like, what are you doing here, Tom? Like, what's this? And it's because it started out as like an in-studio joke. But again, Tom Petty is somebody who by that point in his career had been writing pop rock songs for like 20 years all the time. And so when he sat down to write a joke song, he actually wrote a really good song. So yeah, sorry for my Tom Petty diversion, but it was occupying my mind for the reasons I stated. I won't back down, Free Falling, and he also passed away recently and was someone who was not quite as, ornate, or like didn't have the songwriting awards lavished upon him. Doesn't get the like academic assessment that like Paul Simon, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, other rock and roll artists get, but he is somebody who very much exists on the same level in terms of the like craft of his songwriting. It's just a little bit different. And I think that's kind of the case for Mary Oliver, who won a lot of awards, but also came in for, as you were saying, like curmudgeonly academics would sort of give her a hard time for loving nature and stuff.
Yeah. And a lot of those curmudgeonly academics were dudes. And there was definitely is a sexist element to the way that she was received over the years.
Very much so. It's an important point.
But yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it through the Tom Petty. As a side note, way back in the day when I was first listening to Free Fallin' as a kid, I thought the lyrics was she loves Cheez-Its and not Jesus. And that resonated with me a lot because I love Cheez-Its, and she really did seem like that would be the one for me.
Oh my God.
So when I learned that the real lyrics were Jesus, I was actually pretty disappointed.
Connor, you're blowing my mind right now. I love it. That's incredible.
Yeah, language is hard. It's like you hear something and the ear is an imperfect tool, let me tell you.
Call Wittgenstein. Get him in here to solve this.
Yeah, seriously. But I do think that the point that you were making about his worry that won't back down will just be a something said rather than like a more of a song. I think that speaks to an important point about poetry too. Another way of saying what I had said was that when I remember this poem or other Oliver poems, I remember the statement part of it. You know, I remember, tell me what you'll do with your one wild and precious life. And I think that oftentimes, because Oliver does have those statements that are so like powerful and then get quoted out of context of the poem, she sort of, I think people think of her sometimes as, you know, she's not really writing poems, she's just writing like self-help or something like that, which I think is not the case. And that's what was so I loved doing so much in this poem, was just thinking about the ways in which this poem, while it was making statements, was itself just a kind of, you know, emotional experience. And the way I started thinking about that was just thinking about the way that the poem, you know, moved and the different kinds of little arguments or things that happen in it. You know, it begins with, you do not have to be good, and there's this kind of like, you only have to love, you know, the soft, you have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loved. You know, that's the essential thing. And then, you know, tell me about despair. So there's this kind of like, first, this like letting the you off the hook in some kind of a way from something that's keeping them from accessing, you know, love or self-worth or something. And then there's this sort of reach out to the you to, you know, tell me about despair, your despair, and I'll tell you mine. There's this connection, this bridge that's being, you know, built there in the poem. And then there's this, meanwhile the world goes on. So there's like the me and the you, and then there's the world happening, sort of regardless of whatever you're doing. And then this is where I feel like I was very surprised, and I'd only noticed when I was reading it this time. There's the part where it says, you know, whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. And both of those things by themselves are sort of interesting but straightforward sort of things to think about. The world goes on, and, you know, the world is there for you to think about and fill your imagination with. But together they actually have a kind of tension and a kind of interesting relationship. You know, one is the world is indifferent to you in some kind of way. Meanwhile, the world goes on. But then the next thing that's said is it offers itself to your imagination, which don't sort of intuitively go together. And so that's kind of like a moment, I feel like, when the poem, like it was a poem before, but it becomes a poem in some kind of way, where there's like the movement of thought is not cohesive as an argument, but is rather indicative of a kind of, you know, emotional and intellectual experience that's progressing as the poem is progressing. Yeah, I was just very interested with that. It made me think of like, it's only when you can kind of accept that the world is going on that then you can also like then reapproach the world like with your imagination or something. Like there's a kind of like, there's steps that are needed to kind of open up this you that's in this dark despair, this kind of isolation. to feel connected again. Anyway, I was just curious, how you were thinking about like the way that the poem progressed. I was dazzled by it. It was very moving to me.
Yeah, I am in agreement. I think in terms of how the poem progresses, it feels to me a little bit like there are two lines that kind of jumpstart its movement. And it is kind of what you were pointing out. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine, which then kicks off into the three meanwhiles, which is while the world goes on, and then this list of different natural places, almost as though you're like, you are the goose flying over all these places. And then the next meanwhile is the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. And then I think the next line that kind of jumpstarts the next part is whoever you are, no matter how lonely. And so the two lines to me that offer the greatest momentum in the poem are the two that are dealing with despair and loneliness. And so while this poem is, I think overall, I leave it with a sort of hopeful, like I'm not despairing when I end this poem. I don't feel like it's pointing me in the direction of further melancholic introspection, let's say. It's sort of like, hey, I know that you are feeling these feelings and they are real. And in fact, I have them too. But don't forget, there's all of this other stuff out there and you are a part of that too. And what is so important to make that message work and not feel like, a postcard, oftentimes these pieces, as you were saying, they get taken out of context and then put into a meme. Well, tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. Well, actually, the line before that is, doesn't everything die at last and too soon? There's like a real, like that, those lines about what are you going to do with your life? It's not just, ooh, your life is so great. What are you going to do with it? Endless possibilities. No, it's like, hey, death is like inevitable. Like maybe kick ass while you're here a little bit. But I think that's a part of Mary Oliver's work that is often overlooked when pieces of it are excerpted or when she is being unfairly maligned. It's like there's this deep current of sadness and despair and all this other stuff running underneath it that she is in many ways writing against in her sort of poetic project, which is to like get people to pay attention to the really great stuff going on around them, not to discount the importance of the like hard and challenging and despairing and lonely and all that stuff. Like part of the reason that she is so into the natural world is because it was her refuge from a horrible childhood and continued to be her refuge throughout her life. In thinking about the movement of the poem, I feel like what helps it move are those pieces of like despair, loneliness, the really darker parts that are still very present. Even the geese, which are like the hopeful sign in some ways, are harsh and exciting. Like the natural world isn't a perfect, pristine place. It's just a sort of vast and beautiful one.
Yeah, I think that is a really essential point. And I was also thinking about the harsh, that use of the word harsh seems so key. Because there is another version of this poem that is just on like a tranquil pond and everything is very pretty and stuff. And that's often I think like then when people like make fun of quote unquote nature poetry, I feel like it's often framed in that kind of way. And she's very specific about the kinds of nature that she's talking about. And also, as you were saying, it's not a romantic. I mean, it might be capital R romantic in the, the tradition of like Wordsworth or something like that, or William Blake, but it's not like a nostalgic or like an idealizing of something, I think. The other part about nature that I thought was very interesting was it's also not like I'm admiring this aesthetic thing that's in the natural world and it's so amazing. Like the very important part at the end is that the geese, which is the kind of proxy for the world itself, the simile and the microcosm, is announcing your place in the family of things. So one thing that she does is kind of, it's an insistence that it's not this like the humans are admiring this other thing, nature. It's like the humans are in nature, which is happening, and we have a place within it. And it's just interesting how she does that. Like one thing that I love is the line, "You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves." Partly because that's just very beautiful, and also, um, the soft animal of your body is just a great phrase. But it does, before it also sets up, I think, the ending a little bit, where it's sort of talking about humans, as animal in this kind of way, where it's talking about letting that part of yourself sort of be able to love itself or love whatever it loves. And so then when we get to the end and the geese is sort of announcing your place in the family of things, if you have allowed the animal part of yourself to be more open, then you're more easily, then you can be a part of it, I suppose. So I just thought that was very elegant, because they're quite far apart from each other in the poem. But I thought that was the use of the soft animal, the word animal there, felt like subtly very important toward the closing of the poem.
Totally agree. And it also is this moment of connection to the natural world that comes right before the line that is the moment of connection between the speaker and the you. So it's like this very subtle two lines about connection that are right together as well. That, again, as you were pointing to the way the poem moves, that's a really elegant way to have the poem move.
And I love too how it's the family of things. It's such a like understated way to talk about, like, it's a family. Okay, it has partly the family and the way that we know it when we talk about, like, family relations, but it also probably has a more the scientific family, species, genus, I was kind of thinking. But then it's not like, again, it's not this idealized thing. It's a family of things. It's just a bunch of different things that are connected, and you're just have a place in that. Like, it's not like some holy circle of, I don't know, great demigods, or I don't know. There's not a grandeur to the end, and that feels really important, and surprising, I think. And yeah, I just really appreciate that.
I think you're totally right. It's a very humble ending. And even like the proxy for nature is geese. Like geese are not a fancy nature proxy. There's so many other birds that have much more colorful plumage or are less common, It's like just some wild geese, doing their thing, and you're right there with them, right? It's pretty cool.
In some ways, it made me think of, there's a W.B. Yeats poem called "The Wild Swans at Coole," which is a fairly well known. It's quite different in some ways, but it's about, Coole is this place in Ireland, but basically the speaker encounters like 59 swans in this place. It's very specific about the number, and has this kind of, huge moment. And it's an interesting counterpoint, because the swans are in that poem called, brilliant creatures. They're on the brimming water, autumn beauty, the bell beat of their wings. So it's serving a different purpose, but in that way, the swans are the kind of like elegant, like majesties of the natural realm. And in here, it's the wild geese that are harsh and exciting. And so, yeah. Anyway, I was thinking about different large winged animals.
No, I think that's such a cool connection because it is a little bit, as you were saying, the geese are described very differently here, the degree to which they are, but it's also such a different idea of what nature is, or what, something meaningful in the presence of nature can be, because you can have these sort of beautiful swan birds and you're like, wow, cool birds. Or you have these wild geese, which are harsh and exciting. It's like this body and approachable version of nature that is just sort of there for you to, the world offers itself to your imagination. Here are these geese offering themselves to you. You can take them as they are, these kind of unremarkable birds that you see all the time, or the world may be offering itself to your imagination, and you can do what has just been done earlier in the poem and imagine them flying over a place, where the world goes on, the sun and the clear pebbles and the rain are moving across the landscapes, over prairies and the deep trees and mountains and the rivers. Like, maybe you can imagine where this goose has flown instead of just taking it as it is. Open your imagination. Let the world in.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And imagination is such a important word, and is like such an important word for poetry specifically. It's often Wallace Stevens has a big thing about how imagination is, in crude terms, the best, or the ultimate sort of way of being or something. And in William Carlos Williams' book Spring and All, there are these poems, but then there's these long rambling prose sections, and they're basically all about the power of the imagination and the form itself too. And I think this is in part its difficulty, but in part its great reward. Is poetry relies so heavily on the reader's imagination to sort of do its work. I mean, we live in a time when you actually don't have to have that much imagination. Like, we're very stimulating, film and TV and like video games are sort of occupy all of our senses. And so it doesn't require much work on our part to like have a quote unquote satisfying experience. But poetry is even less stimulating in some ways than fiction, which has the juice of narrative or whatever. And so it's I always think that there's a slight little nod to poetry whenever imagination sort of crops up in a poem, because it's kind of the thing that you need to appreciate poetry. But it's also the thing in this poem that you kind of need to be able to open yourself up to like the wider world, and get out of your loneliness in a kind of way.
That's very cool. I like that. I like that a lot.
The last sort of little thing, which I won't super quote, but there was a piece that was written on LitHub, also after Oliver passed away, by a writer, Brandon Taylor. And one thing that he said that I just loved is that he wrote, "I'll say simply that Wild Geese is a poem that made me want to breathe again," which I just think is a beautiful way of talking about it. And and we'll post a link to that article because it's a good essay.
I also read that essay in LitHub, and I think it's something that's really important about Mary Oliver, and particularly this poem, because a lot of people talk about, poetry can save your life and everything. This is a poem that demonstrably has saved lives and relationships. Like, it has had a real world impact. And how often can you like really know that about a poem? And I think that's something really interesting and special about this poem and Mary Oliver as a poet, because she really did reach a lot of people.
You have anything else?
I'd like to say that I think geese get a bum rap. I recently have been, up until maybe 2 weeks ago, I have been guilty of disparaging our winged featherin. I love birds. I know that is controversial in some circles. Many people are afraid of them. I'm into them. Way to go, birds. Geese, I always just thought of as the angry ones who I didn't want to be close to for fear of getting beaked. But then I had a realization about geese, okay? And it kind of has to do with our current political situation.
Whoa.
Because geese provide two very important public services in this time of Trump. Number one, they shit on golf courses constantly, all the time. Way to go, geese. Environmental activists. Keep up the good work, geese. Number two, specifically thinking about the migratory patterns of Canadian geese, they show very little interest in or respect for the arbitrary borders that humans have created, particularly on the North American continent. And at a time when that is a crucial issue, I very much appreciate that they are activists on this as well. So big shout out to geese. Thank you very much, geese. Glad to have you as part of the resistance.
I love that. Should we read it again?
Let's do it. Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. Whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like, 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything is possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.